As the Middle East descends into war, let's take a look at the financials with some of the countries in the region. Hello, this is Chart GPT today. While we know all about what's going on in terms of the conflict going on between Hamas and Israel, but we want to kind of look at the wider countries in the area. It's generally Israel against some of the Islamic Muslim countries around that, some of the key players that may have an effect if this conflict grows. Of course, this is what everybody's all worried about. And specifically Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iran, and Turkey, who have all been supportive of Palestine. So the question is, let's take a look at the economies to see whether or not they have financial stress, not just the ideological stress between the situations. So that might be interesting to see what we can learn if there's going to be additional pressures and not just the ideological pressures. So when we go first look at Israel, they've been, if you look at the difference between Gaza and Israel, you can see that it's, there's not even a competition. 53,000 per year per capita in Israel, and near 3,500 in Gaza. The Israeli shekel, which is their currency there, has fallen off a cliff there, so that's an indication that people are getting worried. They may have to print more money in order to finance their war effort. Their inflation has been coming up, but it's pretty stable relative to other Western economies. And the stock market, which had been doing fairly well, is now starting to fall off a cliff there a little bit. Now the next few chart with more of the Arab states, and we're getting this information off the IMF. You can go to the IMF website and get this pretty readily available. We're looking at the GDP inflation rates, and you'll see a common theme through here, except for a couple countries. Egypt is probably one of the more difficult ones. Their inflation rate now has popped up over 20%. Their growth has been fairly flat. You can see in Iran, again, they have zero participation with the IMF, so they don't have the pressure of the IMF behind them, and probably won't because of their fundamentalist state. Their growth rate has been zero, but their inflation rate is well over 40%, so that's going to add pressure to their internal support of their regimes that are running them. Jordan is a little bit better than inflation rate, but again, their growth rate is near zero. Low in the 0 to 5% area, but their inflation rate has been fairly stable. So Jordan's been reasonably stable. They have accepted outside loans to support them, being one of the more friendly states there. Saudi Arabia, of course, they're oil rich, so they don't need the loan. So their SDR, outstanding purchase and loan, is near zero relative to the IMF. But their growth and inflation has been fairly tame. So not huge growth, but fairly tame. Then we look at Turkey. Of course, they have high inflation, so their population is suffering under huge inflation and near zero growth rates, and the prospects are looking dim. So that's kind of the background of some of the financial situation there. Some other factors that we can look at in terms of those Arab states. Here on the left is the Egyptian pound. It's very controlled, and it's basically over the last 5-10 years is falling off a cliff. So that's suffering a huge inflation. And of course, on the right, you see the Turkish lira, and it's just continually dropped like a stone. Of course, these are inverse the dollar, so you have to look at the charts on an inverse basis. Looking at the Turkish stock market, because you think they're doing really good. Well, that's only because of the inflation. Then you look at the Egyptian stock market, similar to the Turkish, they've been going up, but again, this is a function of inflation and not so much that the growth is driving that growth in the stock markets. So let's get back to our map and see what all this information might mean. Understanding that the backdrop is obviously, if you're a Muslim state, you're going to have to support the Gazans, otherwise you're going to have internal instability. But then the financials, depending on your financials, that might add an additional pressure to either support or not support the West or the Palestinian cause. Looking at Turkey, obviously being part of NATO, they're somewhat married to the West, but Erdogan's situation there is he has high inflation, economy not so good, and he is a very ideological driven person, so that's going to funnel into his thinking, and he's already kind of made his move to bring in harder on the side of the Gaza, regardless of the geopolitical events. And Iran has been able to hide and use Russia, the Russian relationship, to basically ameliorate their financial situation. Despite their ideological concerns, there's probably some differences there. But that's their poor relationship in terms of finance, but their positive relationship with Russia is helping them out a bit. Jordan's another one. They have a minor destabilization risk. They'll probably be asking for more IMF loans to keep them on board. Their economy is flat, but at least they don't have the high inflation rate. So probably the more stable of the bunch is Jordan, but we'll see where that goes. Saudi Arabia, obviously, they have the financial power of the oil, so they're going to be protecting the oil dominance, but they do like to support their vanity project, and of course they were ready to sign a deal with Israel until it kind of went up in flames. So they were very, very much didn't want this war, but they're kind of again forced into it. Egypt is probably the wild card here. They've got a big population. Sisi is a pro-Western president. They have significant destabilization risk because they got 80 to 100,000 troops on the Gazan border to keep them from pouring into the Sinai, and they are not in good shape with the IMF in terms of their economy, so they're going to be looking for big money from the IMF in order to continue Western support. And of course, if they go too far down the Western path, they have that destabilization risk. So what do you think? Do you think the financials will play any part into this in terms of how the countries will behave, or is it purely an ideological situation? Take a look at the AI and see what happens to countries when they get into the boat with the IMF and start taking loans, and what kind of negatives or positives they get from this situation. And of course, we'll have to be watchful. And don't forget to subscribe.